Welcome to our last video on memory. This is Kristen Lazarova, and I'm going to be sharing with you some memory strengthening strategies that you can use beginning today. First, there's a strategy called rehearsal, and this is basically repeating something over and over to yourself. Probably one of the first memory strategies that you learned when you were a child was to repeat something over and over to yourself. And when you did this, you may have been able to remember some of what you were wanting to recall for maybe a test, or maybe you had to recite a poem or something like that. This is a beginning strategy, but it's a very shallow strategy. It won't really help you in the long run to learn complex material. So, as you got a little bit older, as you moved out of early childhood, you probably started to learn about something that's called organization. And that's when you put items into meaningful groups. So you're trying to organize things in order to build on that semantic encoding that you learned about. So rehearsal is more auditory or visual, and organization, we would say, is more semantic. And we're getting a little bit deeper in our processing as we move into this type of strategy. So the final strategy that students learn is something that's called elaboration. And this is where you're actively creating meaningful links between what the items that you're trying to remember. So you're putting together networks of information. You're making connections. So we could say that these steps, or these different types of strategies, moving from rehearsal to then organization and then to elaboration, are the different steps that people take as they move through school. So when you were much younger, you may have used rehearsal, and then you began to use organization, and then you may be moving on to elaboration. But it's also true that some students will rely on rehearsal as their basic form of study. So some students who are in high school or in college might be using this type of study approach. And rehearsal can only get you so far. It might help you to pass a test, and but it's not probably going to be very helpful in helping you to remember information beyond that test, or if you're being asked to apply what you're learning or to make connections. And that's what we really want when we think about learning. We don't want to only memorize, because if we just do that, then we're really not understanding what it is that we've learned. So we want to have that deeper approach to studying and that deeper approach to learning. So if we want to remember something for the long term, we want to use organization or elaboration. So we might think of rehearsal as more of that first step, that baby strategy. It might be useful in some instances when you have to memorize something and you're not asked to think beyond the scope of perhaps like a definition or a term. But if you really want to learn something and remember it, you want to move into organization and elaboration. So what can you do to elaborate? Well, we're going to be looking more at this, but some of the things that you can do is, as you're reading for any of your courses, you can, if you're being asked to have knowledge of terms or theories, you can put those terms or theories into your own words. So what you're doing is you're actively thinking about what it is that you're learning, and you're synthesizing it. You're making it make sense to you. You could also link to existing knowledge. So you might, for example, have heard about something that's related to a term or a theory that you're learning about, or you may have read about something, or you might currently be learning about something that is related. And so if you make that connection and you think about that connection, that's going to help you to be better able to remember what it is that you want to be able to recall. And as it turns out, when students move further in their degree programs, so let's say, for example, that we have a student who is in maybe an economics major, And so that student, when they first take their economics class, they don't have perhaps as much to connect what they're learning to in their mind already. So they're really having to think about, maybe come up with examples or find additional articles or sources in order to link what they're learning to something that's meaningful. And then what happens is, as that student takes more courses within their major, within economics, let's say, then they have more knowledge that they can build onto, that they can link those new concepts to. So typically, students who have that good foundation and have been doing well in their major and they've taken several courses, they're going to do even better because they have more information, more knowledge to link what they're learning to. Another way you can elaborate is through application. So as you're learning something or trying to remember something, it's very helpful to think about examples from your own life, how you would apply what you're learning, or examples that are related to things that you may have read, whether it be in the course textbook that you're using, maybe an article that you had to read, or maybe something that you saw on the news, or even in a television program. So anytime you can come up with examples where you can see the application of what you're learning, this is allowing you to have deeper processing. And the deeper we can process what we're learning, the easier it is going to be for us to later recall that information and to recall it in a variety of contexts so that we think about, for example, with rehearsal, if all you've done is memorized a term and a definition, then that means that you have to see that exact definition in order for you to recall the term. But because what you've done is you only have that linear understanding, linear meaning that one line that's drawn between the term and the concept. But if you can think about what you're learning more deeply and create multiple links so that you're not just memorizing, you're processing that information more deeply, then even if the definition or concept isn't presented in a way that's exactly the way that you read it, you know what is being asked of you. And you may also be then, if you're doing that, you're going to be able to respond to essay questions, you're going to be able to identify examples that are being provided on a test. You're going to be able to talk about that concept in class and to answer questions and to really make meaning from what it is that you're learning. I think visualization is another way that we can elaborate. So for example, let's just say that as we think about concepts like classical conditioning, which you learned in the module on learning, if you visualize, let's say, little Albert being classically conditioned to fear the white rat, and you visualize each of those elements, and then you visualize him becoming afraid of not just the white rat, but all things that are white and furry, like bunny rabbits and cotton balls and Santa Claus beards. So as you are visualizing that, you're now creating even more connections in your mind. So the more that you can link what you're learning to different things that you've learned and to real world examples and to images in your mind, the more likely you are to recall it. I know for myself, I have also found that listening to podcasts has been helpful. Now, you may not need to do that in some of your courses, but I think if you're finding something interesting, listening to a podcast can be helpful because what you're doing is you are listening to something, you're listening to perhaps if the podcast is, let's say, I want to listen to a podcast about how does personality develop? Well, as I do that, then I'm going to hear some alternative examples. I'm going to be able to remember some of the comments that the speaker made and this is an auditory processing that I'm having. So it's another way to process that more deeply. So anytime I can process what I'm learning more deeply, the easier it's going to be for me to be able to recall that information. So I'd like to share with you the research-based strategies that you can use to help you to remember things better. And these are strategies that I think will be useful for you in your own courses that you're taking and even just in your day-to-day interactions as you meet new people and you try to remember their name, or you try to remember things that you need to do. So let's take a look at each of these strategies. All right, so number 10, this is the total time hypothesis. And this hypothesis basically says that the more time you spend doing something or spend on something, the more likely you're going to be able to recall it, or the better you are going to be at remembering it. So it's that old adage, practice makes perfect. But keep in mind, it's not just the amount of time that I spend doing something that matters. It's the quality of that time that I spend doing something that's important. So all time is not created equal. Let's say that I could, for example, just stare at my textbook for an hour. So I can remember being in college, and sometimes when I would read something, I just that I didn't find very interesting, I might just read through it, and I really wasn't actively processing it in the way that I needed to. And I would quickly realize that I wasn't remembering what I needed to. So if I do that for an hour, if I'm just staring at my textbook, that's not going to be very effective. If I did that for an hour, probably it would be more effective if, let's say, I spent 30 minutes instead actively processing what I'm learning. And it would be even better if I spent that same hour actively processing what I'm learning. So remember, actively processing is that elaborative rehearsal, and it can also involve organization. So I'm using my time well. I'm applying what I'm learning here in this chapter by processing that information at a deeper level and using that time very well as I study something. So the practice that you engage in is going to include some of the strategies that I'm going to be looking at here in just a moment. So we'll be looking at these strategies that are going to be important for you as you think about that total amount of time that you're spending putting towards a subject that you need to study. Number 9 is encoding specificity. And this principle shows that memories are linked to the context in which they're created. So it's basically stating that it's easier to recall information when you're in the same context in which you studied it. So for example, if you study for a test in a specific room, the idea is that you're going to perform better on that test if you take it in the same room. Now, teachers have used this when we think about standardized testing, and what they've done is they've concluded in their minds that it's better for students to learn material and then take that bubble test that you see here in the same room. And yeah, that is important, but what's even more important is having had practice with that type of testing. So you're taking it really a step further. So you're learning in that same, it's not just the same physical environment, we're talking about the same type of testing. So having that exposure to that type of testing can be helpful if we want students to be at their best, to do their best. So students need to have had some practice with this type of testing. I think it's interesting to note too, with this encoding specificity, that even mental states like our mood can serve as a cue for trying to remember something. So when we think about the environment, you all have probably had this experience where maybe you went to the kitchen to get something and you can't remember what you were in the kitchen to get. And then suddenly you look at a certain part of the kitchen and you recall what it is that you're wanting to remember. Or perhaps you go back to where you originally were, and that serves as a cue. So cues in our environment can be very helpful for us. They trigger our memories. And I think multiple choice testing is an example of how well cues can stimulate our memories. So let's think about, for example, how many of you, maybe you've taken a test, and maybe you're taking a test, and I've seen this in class before, where students are taking a test, and then I notice them looking up at the whiteboard or staring up at something in the room, and then I see them write down the answer or fill in the answer. And I know that it's plausible that they're just thinking, but I also know that it's very plausible that as they look around and they suddenly remember what it is that they want to recall, that whatever they're looking at has served as a cue to help them to remember what it is that they want to. So it could be that the window, it could be the back of their classmate's head. So anything in their environment can help to trigger those memories. And I think it's interesting to note that our mental states, like our mood, can serve as a cue. So, when you're feeling happy or sad or nervous, each of these then can serve as a trigger or help to remind you of other times when you felt the same way. Now, think about how this could be problematic. So, if you're feeling down or sad, then what are you going to be likely to recall? Things that are sad, because those feelings that you have serve as cues for memories for other things that are related to that particular experience. We can also have physiological cues that can serve as a source of a cue. So let's say, for example, that every day that you go into class or every day that you learn something or study something, you're drinking coffee. Maybe you drink a couple of glasses or a couple cups of coffee. And so what are we going to say that you need to do then when you go in to take your test? You need to be in that same level of physiological arousal. So you want to make sure that you're drinking that same amount of coffee so that that physical state is serving as a cue for your ability to remember whatever it is that you need to. Now, we might also say that if you don't typically drink coffee when you're learning, is it going to be a good idea then for you to drink coffee whenever you're trying to recall? No, it's not. You want to keep yourself in that same state so that those internal physiological cues then are helping you to remember and you have those cues present. All right, so let's look at number 8. This is distributed practice or the distributed practice effect. And we could also think of this as spaced practice. And so distributed practice involves you practicing something over several sessions that are spaced out over time. And this is quite different from spending a lot of time at once, let's say right before a test, and studying. It turns out that people tend to remember more if they distribute their practice over time than if they were to just study in one block of time right before a test. So with spaced practice, what's happening is you may actually be doing somewhat around the same amount of work, but you're actually able to have some time between when you're studying. So here's why this is beneficial. Couple of reasons. One, it turns out that whenever you are studying right before a test, maybe you cram, what researchers have found is that students will often have a feeling that what they're studying is pretty easy. And they then go in to take the test and their scores aren't as great as they would be if they'd had that distributed practice. And what happens, the reason that they think that that is easy, the students tend to have that perception in their mind versus when they engage in distributed practice, in which they don't tend to have that type of feeling, is that there's something about that space and time between study sessions that creates this feeling that there is some degree of difficulty, which might actually improve then the amount of focus that students are giving. It might also help the student to be more motivated to make connections between what they're learning and what they already know. And what's also happening too is that students are they're getting sleep in between study sessions and in between when they study and when they take the test. And this is important because sleep is a time, especially as you learned about REM sleep, this is when memory consolidation is happening. And if we want to build what we've learned, we want to have a good foundation, we need to study then sleep, so that we're building that foundation. I almost think of it as like mortar between bricks. You want to build that foundation and you do so while you're sleeping, when your memories are consolidating. And so actually researchers have conducted a variety of studies to see how test grades are affected by what's called massed practice, which is where you're studying for one large block of time, versus distributed practice. And what in studies where they've compared those two different approaches, where people have studied the same amount of time, they have found that consistently students tend to score higher on tests when they engage in distributed practice. And on average, Students will tend to score about 15% higher when they use distributed practice versus mass practiced. And so we want to think about this evidence-based strategy. It's really helpful to use this distributed practice when you're studying. So think about it too as, you have, let's say, someone who's practicing to play at a basketball game. You probably, if you were going to bet on the person who was going to, or the team that was going to do well. Let's say you have a team that just practices the night before and that's it, versus the one that's been practicing regularly. Even if you have a team that practices for 15 hours straight right before the big game versus one that has practiced every day for 15 days for 1 hour, you're going to bet on the one that's been regularly practicing. And so you inherently the benefit to that distributed practice as well. Okay, and number 7, this is called short term or called working memory. And what this means is that you want to find a way to reduce your short-term memory overload. So what I would suggest is that before you come to class or before you watch one of the learning videos is that you read the textbook. And why is that? Well, because your short-term memory then will not be overly taxed when you're trying to hold in new information that you're learning in class or as you listen to or watch one of these videos. So by reducing that short-term memory overload, then this can make the learning session more fruitful or beneficial for you. So look for ways to reduce that incoming flood of information. Number 6, and I touched on this as we looked at elaborative rehearsal just a brief while ago, and this is perhaps one of the most useful strategies. What you're doing is you're consciously striving for deep processing as opposed to shallow processing. So how do you do that? Well, we're going to look at some of these sub-strategies next here in just a moment. And number 5 is mnemonic devices. And you all have used mnemonic devices before, like the one that you see here. But so before we look at these deeper strategies, you've all been exposed to this sort of memory trick. But this is not really a practice-related strategy. It's really just a simple strategy for remembering something that is pretty small in its level or depth. And mnemonic devices don't only need to be like the one that you see here, where you're using, let's say, letters that you put into some sort of meaningful pattern, like here, Roy G. Biv. It could also be something, some visual strategy that you use. So think, for example, as you're learning when you were in maybe elementary school, like in 1st or 2nd grade, and you were learning greater than and less than, and those symbols. Well, an easy way to remember the greater than would be that think about that greater than symbol as a big wide open mouth, and it's going to want to eat the bigger number. So that's sort of just this real easy strategy that you can use, a sort of visual strategy that you can use to try to remember something. Or let's say that, you could use this strategy too when you meet someone that for the first time and you want to try and remember their name. So let's imagine that you meet someone whose name is Kim and you know that Kim likes to work out. So you could have just a real easy mnemonic strategy or device. Like you could say, Kim goes to the gym. And so it rhymes, it's easy to remember. And so that when you see Kim, you're going to be pretty likely or more likely to remember Kim's name and something about what she likes, which is going to the gym. And in a previous video, you learned about something called chunking. And this is another type of strategy that we could put under this category. And this is where you're grouping those individual units into larger units of meaning. So maybe you want to remember a series of numbers, and so you could group those numbers into larger units. And remember, we do this when we're trying to remember phone numbers. Remember, our short-term memory can hold about 7 plus or minus 2 pieces of information, and phone numbers with an area code have 10 individual units. So we can increase what we're able to put into our short-term memory by grouping those individual units. So we have, like, for example, 423, 323, 3191. That's the Northeast State phone number. That's 10 digits, but it's only 3 chunks of information. So I could fit feasibly 6 more chunks of information there into my short-term memory as I organize this. I could also organize things into categories. And then there's also something that is narrative technique, which involves us making stories that involve the words that you want to remember. But probably the most familiar mnemonic device is the first letter technique, and that's just like the one that you see on the screen here. You might have heard, like, another one: please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, to remember the different order of operations in math.
Or the
So these are just some helpful mnemonic strategies, not deep processing, but if we're just wanting to remember something at a pretty shallow level, and we just need to remember some basic information, this can be an effective strategy. Number 4 is the self-reference effect, and it is exactly what it says. What you're doing here is you're connecting what you're learning or what you're trying to remember to yourself. The more you can connect what you're learning to yourself, the easier it will be for you to recall that information. So as you'll note, whenever I've encouraged you to, as you're studying, I've mentioned before in videos and as I've sent out emails and in any of the student learning guides, I encourage you to apply what you're learning, and as you're doing it, to connect what you're learning to your own life. And as you do this, and I know sometimes it's not always plausible because not everything you're learning connects to your own life, but anytime that you can, the better you're going to be able to recall whatever it is that you want to remember. So there's a lot of research support for this. So remember, just make as many connections to your own life as you possibly can whenever you're trying to study something. So number 3 is distinctiveness. So you go into a job interview and the interviewer asks you, what makes you stand apart from others? And this is your chance to be remembered. People tend to forget information that's not distinctly different from other memory traces. So examine a concept or an item and then think about what sets it apart. And then, if you've learned, for example, a new psychological concept, compare it to some other concept and then note how those differ. So distinctiveness can be especially helpful in remembering names. Number 2, this is undivided attention. You all know about this real struggle that each of us has. And I can't tell you the number of times that I might be maybe talking with my husband or maybe my kids, and I don't feel like I'm getting their full attention. And I'm sure they felt that way with me as well. And we know that the more focused you are, the more you are attuned to what a person is saying, the more likely you are to remember whatever it is that you need to remember. So you want to look at the person while they're speaking. You want to give them your full attention. When you do this, you're much more likely to remember. So often we will, forget, for example, where we put our keys or where we put our phone. But if we really analyze or think back about what is it that led us to forget, probably we weren't paying that much attention when we came into our house with our keys or when we set down our phone. So if we pay attention, we're much more likely to remember. Sometimes people will think something's going wrong with their memory because they're just not remembering the things that they used to be able to, or they're not remembering as well. And while there could be things going on, potentially, it's probably pretty unlikely. And it's more likely that the person just isn't paying attention. It may be that they have a lot of things on their mind. It may be that that they're very easily distracted because maybe they have a lot of things going on in their environment. I know for myself, when I'm around a lot of people, it's like in my house, for example, when I come home and my kids are asking lots of questions or they're talking to me about different things, my attention is immediately directed to them and it's not directed to my keys or my phone. So it's very easy for me to forget where I put those things. And number one is elaboration. And this is number one because it's probably the most effective strategy. And what I'm doing here is I'm actively thinking about how what I'm trying to remember or learning fits into what I already know. I'm turning the information over in my mind to look at it from different sides, from different angles. So one way I elaborate might be to explain a concept to myself. Another way that I elaborate is through teaching, and teaching forces anyone to elaborate. So if you want to remember something, I would highly recommend that you try teaching it to someone else. So what memory strengthening strategies will you try? And what do you currently use that's helpful for you? So I'm going to create a survey that I'm going to put within this module. It'll just be a very brief survey where I'm going to ask you to share what strategy you use or strategies. And then this will be helpful as your classmates will be able to see what you're doing. And this is anonymous, so they won't know who this is coming from, but it's a great chance for us to learn from each other. I look forward to seeing each of you online. And as always, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch with me.